All right, welcome and falcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim on May 16, 2021, which is Random Thoughts are my half hour to just tell some stories, some history, some yarns, legends, and my random thoughts. This is Beltana, by the way. At least it's almost here in northern Michigan, County Antrim, Michigan. Beltana is an ancient Celtic celebration. It celebrates the end of spring and the beginning of summer. And in Ireland, it's usually celebrated in early May. Here, though, summer doesn't arrive typically till late May. Memorial Day, the last Monday of the month, is the unofficial first day of summer here in northern Michigan. And Beltana, in very ancient times, was celebrated as the first of summer, as I said. It eventually kind of evolved into a date kind of halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. And that's how it got closer to May the 1st. And it's one of the earliest festivals noted in Irish literature. And it's often the date in which cattle was driven from around the village and out to summer pasture. It was also the date when crops were planted, and the weeks before and after when crops were planted, and everyone got ready for the summer to come. And bonfires are associated with Beltana. People performed a lot of rituals to protect the cattle as well as the crops and protect the people. And fire played an important part of that ritual. So people set up big bonfires in and around the villages, and cattle were often led around and through, circling around these bonfires, and that was intended or believed to give them some special protection. And people sometimes would actually leap over the fires or over the embers as part of that ritual. And I don't know how many people were hurt in that process, but it was one of the things people did during or on Beltana. And people actually doused all other fires in the village to set the bonfires, and then they ritualistically reset their fires by using a torch lit from the bonfire to set the fire in their own home. And doors and windows and even the cattle were often decorated with yellow flowers. That was somehow symbolic of Beltana. Beltana was celebrated throughout Ireland up until maybe the mid-20th century, and it largely died out, although there are still Beltana festivals and celebrations in Ireland. It's been somewhat revived in the last couple of decades, but even if not celebrated, it's still recognized as Beltana, as a special day. And often events that are scheduled in late April, early May, are often called Beltana festivals. It was a year ago, actually, that I participated in a Beltana gathering. It was in Ireland, although we all participated via Zoom because the pandemic had hit. This is May of 2020 when we did this. And it was for members of the Storytellers of Ireland. And we took turns telling 5-minute stories. And that was our Beltana gathering. And I didn't receive notice of a Beltana gathering for 2021. So if they had one, I didn't participate. Now, I don't know if it was simply they didn't organize it, although maybe they organized it and just didn't invite me. Maybe they didn't like the story I told last year. I don't know, but I didn't do that this year. But that's Beltana. Remember that. Summer begins, that's Beltana. It's from an ancient Celtic celebration. Now we are approaching the 1-year anniversary of Random Thoughts from County Antrim. I did my first one on May 31st, 2020. And I was then and remain confident that I have enough of a repertoire of stories and yarns and historical trivia that I won't have to repeat myself in any of these podcasts. And I certainly have an infinite amount of random thoughts, so I thought each one of these podcasts would be different without repeating things I've done before. But I did look back at those first two podcasts, the last one in May and the first one of June 2020. And I have to confess, they were terrible. And I don't mean terrible content. I mean the quality of the production was bad. I couldn't get the audio and the video in sync, so you'll see my mouth moving, and the words kind of trailing behind, and even froze a couple of times. Two of those videos, and so I'm going to repeat. I'm going to feel free anyway to repeat some of the stories I said during those first two podcasts. And one of those stories is called The Clockwinder. So I'm going to tell you the story. After I have one more sip of my coffee, I'm going to tell you the story of The Clockwinder. Now, there is a man in County Cork by the name of Seamus O'Leary. And he's a clockwinder by trade, and by all accounts, he's quite proficient in his occupation. He plies his trade throughout the county, and he's quite well known for his skills as a clockwinder. It was a few months back that my wife told me that her clock was in need of winding, and she told me to fetch Seamus O'Leary. And once I found him, I was to spend a few hours at the pub. Now, I'm a man who enjoys my time at the pub. And I enjoy having a few pints at the pub, but I'm usually chastised for that proclivity. My wife had never before encouraged me to go to the pub, so I was not about to pass up the opportunity, and I did as I was told. I found Seamus O'Leary, and I told him that my wife is in need of a clock winding, and he said, I will come over to your house and wind her clock straight away. And then I went to the pub, and I had a few pints of Guinness. Truth be told, I had more than a few pints. I was there quite some time, and I had 4 or 5. Who's counting? I had a lot of Guinness while I was at the pub. So I went home after that. When I got home, I saw my wife, and she was happy. Now, I might add that is not her typical demeanor. And I asked her how her day went. She said her clock was wound quite nicely, and it had been far too long since her clock had been wound so well. Now, several weeks passed, and my wife said, I am in need of a clock winding yet again. And she told me to go fetch Seamus O'Leary and tell him I am in need of a clock winding. And after you do so, go spend some more time at the pub. And in fact, why don't you place a few wagers on the ponies? And with that, she opened up her purse and pulled out a few shillings for me, for my wagers. Now, as I said, I'm a man who enjoys my time at the pub, and I also enjoy wagering on the horses. But I'm usually chastised for that proclivity. My wife had never before encouraged me to wager on the ponies, and certainly has never given me the money to make my wagers. So I was not going to pass up the opportunity, and I did as I was told. I found Seamus O'Leary, and I told him my wife was in need of clock winding, and he said he would come over to my house and wind her clock straight away. And then I went to the pub, and I had more than a few pints of Guinness, and I bet on more than one race of the ponies. In fact, I did quite well on my wagers. I was up quite a bit, over the course of the afternoon, until I got to the last race, where I lost it all. And then I went home. And when I got home, I saw my wife, and indeed, she was happy. And I had not seen her so happy since the last time she was paid a visit by Seamus O'Leary and had her clock wound. Now a fortnight passed after that, and my wife told me her clock was stuck yet again. And of course she told me to fetch Seamus O'Leary. So I did as I was told. I found Seamus O'Leary. I told him my wife was in need of a clock winding. He said he would wind her clock straight away. And then I went to the pub. Now when I got to the pub, I was kind of surprised because the man who was supposed to deliver the Guinness that day, that morning, failed to make the delivery. And because of that, the pub had no Guinness. Now, who would stay at a pub which had no Guinness? And I had no money to wager on the ponies anyway. So I went home. And when I got home, I was shocked to see right there in my parlor was Seamus O'Leary winding me wife's clock. And I said right then and there, Seamus O'Leary, you are not to do your clock winding at my home again. And I said to my wife, don't let Seamus O'Leary come in here anymore. He wound up your clock and left mine on the shelf. If your clock needs winding, I'll do the winding myself. And let that be a lesson to all the husbands who are listening to this podcast. Every wife needs a good clock winding once in a while. And if she does, you best do the winding yourself, or Seamus O'Leary will. And that's the story of the Clockwinder. Now, I did that story, I think I've done it twice during the pandemic, and both by Zoom, I must add. And I elaborated a little bit, mainly by noting that clock winding has been deemed an essential service. So even in the midst of a lockdown, one may still retain the services of a clockwinder. Had to make it an essential service when I looked at the many, many essential services that were allowed during the pandemic, and it varied by region to region, state to state, city to city. Obviously, medical care, all health care was essential service. The food delivery system was all deemed essential, but there were some strange ones. Tattoo parlors in some places were allowed to be open as an essential service. So why not clock winding? So I added that to the story. I'm often asked, how do I come up with my stories? And I've even conducted some workshops on storytelling. And many of my stories are stories I've heard from others, and I've just retold them, and I added my own twist and takes on stories that came out of the ingenuity or the creativity of other storytellers, and some that have been around for generations. I can't tell you who came up with the story, but I've heard these old stories and just added my take to them. So in that sense, they're not original stories. But many of my stories are original stories, and the Clockwinder is one of them. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes just to comment on the process of coming up with a story. And I'm always looking for a good euphemism, a good metaphor. I do a lot of stories to adult audiences, and I prefer to tell stories for an adult audience that's not X-rated or even R-rated, but still designed for adults. And it's just more fun to use a euphemism. And it makes the story better than being explicit about what may be going on. And sometimes euphemisms are necessary. I told a story once, at a Irish festival, not the Clockwinder, but another one that had sort of an adult theme. And it was in a small tent, and I looked around. I went through several stories, and I was getting near the end of my set. And I was trying to figure out what story I'd tell next. And I looked around the tent, and they were all adults. So I went ahead and started telling a story that's a little bit risque. And I'm getting around. I'm about 2/3 of the way done with the story. And then a woman walks into the tent with holding hands with 2 young kids. I'm trying to decide, hell, what do I do now? Do I just stop the story? And I'm thinking this while I'm telling the story. I'm telling the story and thinking, now what do I do at the same time? And I'm trying to think, how do I soften the story? And I finally realized I couldn't. I had to just plow through and get it done. And I got through the story. I got a big laugh. It was a neat story. Got it done. And when we were, then I said, that was the end, and I mingled around with the crowd, and I walked up to the woman with her kids. I told her that I'd started that story before she entered the tent, and I didn't know how to stop it. So I told it anyway, and I apologized if it offended or bothered her with her kids. And she says, no, it didn't bother me at all. She says, but I will tell you, after you got done, my son turned to me and said, Mom, I don't get it. So I guess it was all right to tell a story where the kids don't get it. But again, you can do that if you have a euphemism or for what it is you're talking about. So how did the Clockwinder come about? Well, there's an Irish song called the German Clockwinder. And it's not a staple among Irish musicians. I've only heard it a couple of times. And it's a cute song. Not necessarily funny, but it's cute. It's about a German clockwinder in Dublin who goes into a house when the husband is away and winds the clock of the woman at home. And then he skips along to the next house. And as he's skipping along, that's the chorus where he's singing Tu la rue la ruma. Skipping from house to house, visiting women as their husbands are away. Now, if you read the lyrics, if you just read them, because I can't sing that song, if you just read those lyrics, it's not terribly funny, and I wasn't sure what to do with it, except that I liked the euphemism of clockwinding. It was funny, at least to me. And then I played around with building a story then around a clockwinder. And it occurred to me that the song was written in the point of view of the clockwinder. The wives and the absent husbands really aren't mentioned at all. It's all about the clockwinder going from house to house. And I couldn't come up with a good way to tell that story. And then it occurred to me to change the point of view of the story from that of the clockwinder to that of the husband. And playing around with that concept, I decided to make the husband not merely unknowing of what's going on, but make him complicit. Make him the naive husband. So make the wife tell the husband to go fetch the clockwinder. And then have the wife tell the husband to disappear for a while. And once I changed the point of view of the story, it became much, much easier to write. I mean, just how do you make, once you decide you got to make the husband disappear, how do you make him disappear? Well, easy. You tell him to go to the pub. Tell him to go bet on the ponies. What husband would argue with that? And so I was able to build that part of the story with just having the husband being naive about what's going on and going out to the pub. And of course I had to get the story where the husband catches them in the act of clockwinding. How do you do that? You make them go to the pub and find out it has no Guinness. And that's kind of the gist of how that story was created. And obviously I added some things here and there to kind of flesh it out, but that's the gist of how the Clockwinder was created. And it's one of the lessons I tell when I teach a workshop is you don't start a story, so you don't start creating a story from the beginning. We call that the once upon a time method. Once upon a time this happened, and then you have to figure out what happened next, and then what happened next. If you start creating a story from the beginning like that, sooner or later you're going to come up with a dead end. You won't be able to decide what happens next to make it a decent story. On the other hand, if you start a story with an idea, whatever it is, it might be a euphemism, it might be an interesting character, it might be a strange or interesting situation or a setting, and then you build it from there. You go from there to how it would end, and you go from there to how do you set that up, and fleshing things out in the beginning. What moves that story forward? But by starting with the idea and then going backwards and forwards in the chronology of the story to tell the full story, rather than starting with a beginning and then not knowing where to take the story. Anyway, I was going to tell one more story, but I think I have something else I got to do tonight. So I think I'm going to end this right now. So I thank you for joining me at Random Thoughts from County Antrim. I may add a little bit. I think I'm going to tell you a story that I call Story and Truth. I'll tell that next week to give you a little more elements of storytelling. So in the meantime, please take a look at my website, glandonald.net. By the way, I've been invited to some festivals in the fall. It's kind of curious because I still don't know what's going to happen. I'm anxious to do live storytelling. A lot of festivals in the fall have been canceled. On the other hand, some I think are going to be a go. So I just don't know if I'll be able to do some live performances later in 2021. I've given up on the summer, and I'm not sure I want to go out too far in the summer, not till our vaccination rates go up. I'm vaccinated, by the way, but I still want to see those vaccination rates go up before I'm going in too big of crowds. But I may have some announcements at this week or next week or soon about fall appearances, live performances. But in the meantime, please take a look at my website, glandonald.net. Send me an email at glandonald@gmail.com. And like my Facebook page and visit that and take a look at my videos and like my videos on YouTube. And in the meantime, goodbye and have a nice Beltana.